Shalom. I hope this teaching will be a blessing to you. It's going to be about the Chodesh Festival. Um, just to talk a bit about what some people would call the New Moon Festival or the New Month Festival and how it may have looked in ancient Israel. So I've got quite a lot to talk about here, and it's not been a simple thing to investigate. And typically, we haven't done much thought, I think, beyond just the idea of the Yom Teruah, the day of trumpets, that begins the seventh month. But on a broader level, to even just think about how, in general, things were done around the beginning of the month, at the start of the month, and to maybe think a bit broader about some of these issues beyond the idea of sighting the first crescent and other ideas. So, the first thing with the Chodesh Festival is to really understand this word Chodesh, where it comes from, and to make just good understanding of how we should use it. I've got here in the Hebrew here, that's how you spell it from right to left, Chodesh. And Chodesh means month. I'd say it's over 250 times months, monthly. And 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 yet the translators say that it only means this by implication. But what it literally means is new moon. And this is a bit problematic, I find, for a few reasons. Firstly, when they say Chodesh means new moon, is they do rightly point to the root of it being Chadash, which is to make new. However, when it comes to what was being done around the time of new moon, and it's certainly pointing to the kind of festival at that time, or some sacrifices were being done. The word moon is not in the Hebrew. Chodesh just has Hebrew letters that is connected to new, rebuild, and renew. So the month was understood as a renewal. And well, the word moon isn't there. And also the Masoretes who put in the vowels, they put the vowels in for Chodesh, the vowels that would not be suggesting new. Even when people want to speak about new moon, they will rather use Chadash. So I like what I saw this in the Orthodox Jewish Bible. The places where the scriptures say, "I hate your new moons," and "I hate your I hate your new moons," and they've changed it with, "I hate your Rosh Chodesh, your head of the months," because there it still keeps the vowels of Chodesh, this idea of the head of the month, or Rosh Chodesh, and that we do see in Scripture. We do see a reference to at the start of your months, or at the head of your months, there was this understanding um, of the seasonality where they would sanctify, consecrate the month. There were offerings done in Jerusalem. And so I think rather than these 20 times where they say that means new moon, well, we know it's concerning the new moon festival and the festivities around that time, but most probably what it should better point to is the idea of the Rosh Chodesh, the head of the month. And so when we're talking about the head of the month as Rosh Chodesh, it would be important to examine if they said, "Oh, the Chodesh is coming up," or when God says, "I hate your Chodesh." Uh, what would have been, if we understood it as Rosh Chodesh? What does this word Rosh mean? And what we see, firstly, just to understand that if we are looking for a phrase to connect to this use of Chodesh, where it's just used and translated often as new moon, but we're really wanting one that is on its own right, and to see a phrase that it's most probably referring to when it's used to refer to a day or a season or a time at the front of the month, it would be this one, because we do see this phraseology, let's say, is used within Torah. And we see this just a couple of times in Numbers chapter 10 and in Numbers chapter 28. And it would speak within the context of the Chodesh, the month. There was also a time called the head of the month, Rosh Chodesh. And then to trying to get a sense, well, what did they mean when they said head of the month? What did Rosh mean? Now, Rosh is used, it means head, literally, and so it would be used in different contexts. Let's say it was a leader, then it would often be translated as chief, okay? Or we might say he's the head of the clan. It might be used in terms of mountains. Quite a few times in scripture it will speak about the head of the mountain. We don't use that so much in English anymore. We translate that as top of the mountain. But we get a sense of different contexts in which it is used. Another place that is used is with regards to time. And this is what's important for us, because we're wondering within this context of time, what did Rosh Chodesh mean? Like, what did Israel, in the minds of Israel, did they mean? And well, it's got a little bit of breadth, but not too much. We get enough from Rosh Chodesh to get a sense of what it is. Now, usually it's interpreted and translated as beginning. So some of the English translations will say at the beginning of your month. Okay. And beginning has implied this idea, the foremost day or the first day. All right, so it's definitely bound up with the idea of the first day. But also Rosh or head, that which has prominence, can often also come before, or it can be at the front, the forefront, the front of something as well. So we have a little bit of breadth here in terms of it comes at the front of the month, but it could also have, in a broader understanding, maybe an idea of not just the first day, but maybe at the front of the month as well. It's a period, but again, how do we know? Well, but this is what Rosh, that's all we get is Rosh Chodesh. And in Numbers 28, it does not define Rosh Chodesh as on day one, or we just don't get that. It's like the Sabbath, where we don't get a day of the month for it. It's a bit like the day of the first fruits of the barley harvest. Again, there's no day of the month. And as well with Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, it's just described as the head of the month, and we're not told this is day one, although we're looking around that time, definitely. Okay. And the big question, I think, within those who are returning to a lunar calendar, who are using the moon for the month, is to get into the mind of ancient peoples and ask the question of what used to happen at the front of the month, at the head of the month? What used to happen there? What was the process amongst ancient lunar people, particularly those that would want to cite the new moon? So I've been getting into this, and it's a lot more than just they would look for the crescent new moon. What we actually see is that day 30 and the month and 30 days was also an important part. So I've got a few things here that these seem to be facts that that as much as they would look for the crescent new moon, they would also try and establish whether the old month, whether it was a hollow month of just 29 days, or if it was a full month of 30 days. But they would call it, they would think of it in terms of 30-day months, and now we'll have a look at how they could make a 29-day month a 30-day month. But also what's interesting with day 30 is at the front of the month, they would also begin the search for the crescent at the beginning of day 30. That's also something we'll look at. And then there's also this kind of two evening nature where, yes, the primary look was at the beginning, but there was a secondary look as well, but later. More important in terms of, I would say, the institutions of setting the calendar, that in the kingly courts and that they would look also at the end of that day and make a determining as well, and try and understand to write into the annals which is day one, and to communicate that with the people. And so we get this two evening nature, and it's seen in Jewish tradition, pre-Talmudic tradition, scriptural tradition or description, and there's historical witness as well. And then finally, also just to from there's a point which is that just practical considerations would make day 30 as day one, and so that's something to also just be aware of. So we're gonna look at these as well. So there's more than just sighting the crescent moon. It was kind of around day 30, and this was, it seems, in the ancient cultures, kind of at the front of the month. There was a lot going on there to consecrate the month that has been and look forward to the new month, and to set apart the times, as it were, and how they did that. Okay, now what I put out there is just the idea that perhaps we need to start thinking of the head of the month, Rosh Chodesh, that it may have something to do with Old Moon Day, day 30. That we typically think of it as day one, and I do believe it's connected with day one, but that it also, the way they would sanctify the month and herald it, that it was also very much connected with day 30. So let's go through these one by one. So this first thing, that months were considered 30-day month, and there's this idea of a hollow month and a full month of 30 days. I've got a quote here from John M. Steele, a really good document that I found that helped me just understand a little bit more about the ancient lunar calendars, just how they would determine the month. He says here, the calendar used throughout Mesopotamia was lunisolar. Months began on the evening when the new moon crescent could be seen for the first time, and lasted for either 29 or 30 days until the next new moon crescent was seen. And it's a nice description there, but we definitely, when he says 29 or 30 days, he's talking in our language. What we actually see is in the ancients, they would just talk of it in terms of 30s. And he goes on to explain that how they would look on day 30, and day 30 would be maybe considered day one if the moon was seen, or it would be its own day 30 in and of itself, and then there would be a day following it, or day one would follow that. But we see between these two descriptions of the month, but what we actually, that's an our kind of description, but in terms of how the ancients used to think, they used to talk about a full month and a hollow month. He writes about this here. By the first millennium BC, however, we have unambiguous evidence for the lunisolar calendar. From the 7th century BC, we have a large body of correspondence sent by Assyrian and Babylonian scholars to the kings Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, a significant number of which are concerned with the watch for the new moon at the end of a month, intercalation, and other calendrical matters. From the letters and reports sent by these scholars, we can understand how the calendar operated in practice. At the beginning of the 30th day of the month, a watch was kept for the new moon crescent. If the moon was seen an hour or so after sunset at the beginning of the day in Mesopotamia, that day would be turned back or rejected, turu, and become the first day of a new month. So the 30th day would become the first day. Alternatively, if the moon was not seen that night, then the 30th day was completed or confirmed. It's a little bit simplistic, this description here, but we get a good sense of what they were doing. They had this understanding of months of 30 days long, but sometimes it's a hollow 30-day month, that day 30 is counted with day one, or a full 30-day month meaning day 30 would stand on its own and day one on its own. Now, I've also got a slide here just showing another important article that's helped me look into this a bit, and this is done by Sasha Stern, an Orthodox Jewish man, and he's been looking at what's known as the astronomical diaries of Chaldean astronomers and how they did the lunisolar calendar, the ancient one, and yeah, what you see is to the right. I've put two orange boxes here. On the right, you can see that column is described as cause of non-sighting, and so you see there's these different descriptions of there was clouds, there was dense haze and mist, and anyway, it points to they were literally trying to sight the new moon. That was very important. But that to the left of it in the orange box there, what you'll also see is that it was regulated at 30 at a two descriptions of months were given. When they were described as 30, that was the understanding of a hollow month. It meant that day 30 shared the day with day 1. However, if they spoke of day 1 by itself, that meant that it was a full month and day 1 came after day 30. And this is how the astronomers would express in the records. And this is important because it just shows that in their minds, they actually saw in a hollow month, what we would say is a 29-day month. They would say it's a 30-day month, but that day 30 is shared with day 1. And so that just confirms this idea of months with 30 days and this idea of hollow and full days. And also, I only showed the end of his research there, the last little bit of the page, but actually, he's got, I think it's 441 descriptions over, like, I think it's 7 centuries, and there's never a 31-day month nor a 28-day month. They really worked hard at, yes, citing it, but also that it would be within this range of hollow and full months as well. That was a key part as well with in ancient societies doing the lunar cycle. All right, so the second thing is the beginning of day 30 was for first observations. So at the end of day 29, people would go at sunset and look for the new moon at the beginning of day 30. I also didn't realize this, but this is not just a generalization. This is what they did. And I've got some passages here. This again from John Steele's. We just read it actually, but just to enforce this point, he writes that at the beginning of the 30th day of the month, a watch was kept for the new moon crescents. At the beginning of it. That's important. Now, in Sasha Stern's article, he writes, this is an interesting thing about day 30. As he says, firstly, sighted and non-sighted new moons can occur equally on day 30 or day 1. The point here just being that even with technology today, we can actually figure out how likely we are to see it on day 30. People would look on day 30 regardless of likeliness, but they would just go and check at the beginning of day 30, and you had an equal percent chance of not seeing it. And that's also quite interesting because that seems to be a little bit of a difference to current understandings of the day of when we go looking for it. But we see that day 30 was important at the front of the month for sighting the new moon, but it was at the beginning of day 30. Also, they've got a description here from the Jewish Encyclopedia. It says that the Sanhedrin was assembled in the courtyard of Jerusalem on the 30th of each month from morning to evening, waiting for the reports of those appointed to observe the moon. And so this is a lovely description here again. They would meet, but this is certainly many years after Babylon and that, and anyway, but the Jews of the leading up to the first century, and maybe a while after. Anyway, they would uh, they would wait for testimony to come in, but they would wait on day 30, meaning that it was the evening of day 30 when people looked, and it may not have, there's a 50% chance that it wouldn't be seen that night. Okay? But they would wait for testimony to come in. But again, we see day 30 as linked to the beginning of it, to sighting. And it was quite important in this way. Another passage I have from Encyclopedia Judaica. Originally, the new moon was not fixed by astronomical calculators, but was solemnly proclaimed after witnesses had testified to the reappearance of the crescent of the moon on the 30th of each month. The members of the High Court Sanhedrin assembled in a courtyard in Jerusalem named Beit Yazek, where they wanted to receive the testimony of two reliable witnesses. They then sanctified the new moon. So understand that if things were officially happening before, there was necessarily the sanctioning of the new moon. And if the moon's crescent was not seen on the 30th day, then the moon was automatically celebrated on the next day. So on the 31st day would be declared as day 1. So we see two of these things. We've gone through them, that the months were 30 days, and there's an idea of a hollow and a full 30 days. The hollow, day 30, would share with day 1 of the next month. And then we've also just looked at the beginning of day 30 appeared to be an important time in looking for the new moon and declaring the sanctity of a new month being upon the people. The next thing to look at is the description of the two evening nature of this period around the 30 days, the beginning of the 30th day and then the day going on from day 30. And it's seen in Jewish tradition, pre-Talmudic tradition, scriptural definition, and there's also a historical witness. So let's look at some of these things. I mean, we already saw it in the pre-Talmudic tradition when the Jews hadn't formulated it according to mathematical calculation. We see that they would wait from testimony the night before, so the evening before would be important. And then as people arrived on the day, they most probably, if witnesses have traveled from a few villages away, they would have given them, something to eat. And so this day has this kind of 2 evenings around it. Something like this. And this is not just, this is seen in different cultures as well, that there's this period at the head of the month where they would look to sanctify the new moon. And so let's look at some of the historical witnesses concerning the two times. So yes, you would try and sight at the beginning of day 30, but there also seems to be the evening after as well. This is, I've never heard people talk about this, but this seems to also be just as important, maybe more so on the on really tough calls and knowing how to determine things. There was a second evening as well, which now and then is mentioned. Here's some descriptions. Here's one. We watched on the 29th day. It references to number 44. This is actually meaning at the end of the 29th day. We watched at the end of the 29th day, at the beginning of day 30. The clouds were dense. We did not see the moon. We watched on the 31st day, the end of day 30. We saw the moon, but it was already very high. The weather of the 29th day has to do with it. What is it that the King, my Lord, says? So here we see a description of the 2 evenings, the beginning of the 30th and the end of the 30th, or what was either day 1 or day 2, and needing to adjudicate for the empire to determine the beginning of the month. And so we see this idea of 2 evenings around this period as well. Another one. is here we just see clouds again, could be an issue, and this would also lead to the need to cite and get witnesses as well. In terms of the 2 evenings, uh, here's another interesting one. To the king, my lord, your servant Adad, Sumuru, good health to the king, my lord. I observed the crescent moon on the 30th day. Again, this is meaning at the end of the 30th day. On the day that followed, it was high, too high to be the crescent of the 30th. Its position was like that of the second day. So, if it suits my king, my lord, the king should wait for the report from Asher before fixing the date. Perhaps the king, my lord, will say, why don't you decide? So you see there's um, there's been a tough period of, obviously, on the first night when they tried to observe, there was clouds, they couldn't see. And then the next night they see it, but it was quite high. And they're like, it seems like actually this may be the second day. Maybe wait for a bit of testimony. But they needed to make this call. And you can see this was a really tough month to make the call. But anyway, they had to put something in for the scribes. And so there's this testimony here of certainly of kind of there's initial observance at the beginning of the day 30 and then also at the end as well. What's interesting within the Jewish tradition, and so this is rabbinic, is their description of Rosh Chodesh, the head of the month. Okay. And we know that they codified what was originally a lunar calendar. They've made it a lunar calendar, but it's based on mathematics. But it is interesting when you look at some of their things. Let me go past this and just do this first idea of the Jews. When we look at some of their things, we see that they do Rosh Chodesh in this way. Firstly, they will, if you have a full month, they will actually keep Rosh Chodesh on both day 30 of the old month and day 1 of the new month. If it's a hollow month, they say it's a 29-day month and it goes to day 1 of the next month. As we just learned, the ancient cultures would say, well, you actually are also keeping it on day 30 because day 1 on a hollow month was considered day 30 as well. And so this is really interesting. And this has made me just rethink perhaps the head of the month, what was at the front of the month, was more than just day 1, but could also have included day 30 as well. And so it's interesting. We just see this kind of testimony within the Jewish calendar today, and maybe this points towards it. Now I want to go back to one other thing here, and that is the scriptural description, because we do have this wonderful account with the feast. It comes across as a feast. A sit-down meal that was and the description is that it was at Chodesh, at the head of the month, and the description of it is that it was definitely for 2 evenings, okay, and the first evening we see that that Saul thought that David was maybe unclean. That makes me think that this was when the tabernacle most probably had been moved by Samuel up to Gibeon, Levitical town that seemed to also play an important role at this time, because it seems as though this was a set apart offering, and so you would be put to death if you ate of it and you weren't clean. So the first night he's like, okay, David's not here, maybe he's unclean. But what we do see is that he lied about needing to be at the sacrifices from his hometown, Bethlehem, and so Jonathan makes it the story that he couldn't be there because he had to be there, and his brother made him swear that he would be at this feast. And Saul doesn't buy this. He's on to him. But anyway, we get this description of certainly two evenings, and we get the description of it has this official nature to it. Through that sacrifice, you needing to be clean. So I think Samuel would have been a part of this. And obviously the king is there, and anyway, it's just interesting. And we know the description is that it was over Chodesh. This was happening at Chodesh at the time of what's typically called new moon, but the searching for the new moon, this period of looking for the new moon, and so the head of the month, and what we may understand as being done at the head of the month. Okay, and you can look at some of those scriptures there. All right, we looked at the Jewish description. That's very interesting. Anyway, so that this kind of two evening thing is coming through different sources, and it seems to point to on both sides of day 30, or the beginning of day 30, and then going into day 1, that there was this ritual, and it would be about the going out of 1 month and into the next month. Now, there's also practical considerations that make day 30 as if it was day 1. And I've never thought of this before, but when you actually get down to the practicalities of how this would work, what you realize is that if anything is desired to be done on day 1, you kind of have to do it on day 30, because you don't know if day 30 might be a day 1. It could be pronounced day 1 right at the end of day 30 as 2 witnesses arrive. And so you kind of have to treat everything as day 1 on day 30, and therefore, in a way, day 30 and day 1 would be kept together, have to be kept together. Examples of this is, the first one is with Rosh Chodesh. So it speaks about, in Numbers 28, it speaks about certain offerings that needed to be made on Rosh Chodesh at the head of the month. And again, if you say, no, it must be made on day 1, well, again, the problem is, let's say you're waiting on day 30, and okay, you didn't see the new moon, and they're waiting in that courtyard, and only right at the end, let's say some people arrive, and it's just before sunset. Well, do you do the offerings? Will those offerings belong to that day? What do you do? The other thing is with, I was thinking of this now, it's challenged me with my views of Yom Teruah, but because if the idea is day 30 could be Yom Teruah and you don't know, well, Yom Teruah has a Shabbaton, so not allowed to do regular trade and stuff, and so you would have to treat it as on day 30, you would have, in case it is declared a day 1, you would have to treat it as a Sabbath or Shabbaton, and just in case. And the same would go for the Holy Convocation as well, that you would have to have Holy Convocation on day 30 as well, because it might be day 1, and so it's kind of like they come together and they really do merge these 2 days, and there's kind of this necessity on them being kind of interdependent on each other. And then also just with witness testimony, you'd have to be aware of always day 30 could, because of witness testimony. I may not see the moon, but that doesn't matter in the realm, because the nation needs to be on the same calendar, and so it's not important what I as an individual see, but what the nation sees, and that's dependent on witness testimony, which we don't know, because it takes time to find out on what the declaration of the king is. And so there are these practical considerations that would make day 30 as day 1. And that's just a natural thing if you just practically think about it. Okay, so in terms of the Chodesh Festival, I've also put your festival because it does seem to be linked with song and dance and having a good time, being merry, which typically in Israel means you are slaughtering and eating meat. I saw something yesterday, a brother in the faith, he put up this this picture that says, it's funny, you never see a caveman's picture that has a salad. You know, they're always killing some meat. So there's different joy in Simcha and this, and it seems to involve this head of the month period. And so it'd be good to better understand this. And so let's look at some of the scriptures around this. All right. I don't know why I did two of this. Okay. The first thing to understand is that it appears to this Rosh Chodesh, the head of the month, and the attempts done at this season was to consecrate or to dedicate the seasonality of our God's different seasons. So, for instance, in Numbers 28, you can read about, daily there were sacrifices. They were done in the morning and in the evening, and it was delineating different times. Then there were ones done on the Sabbath, which would obviously that would separate the week and consecrate the week and give thanks to God for the week and then also we have what was just called the month, when he says, "I hate your months." But obviously, this is about the sacrifices that would consecrate the month. And so we read about those in Numbers chapter 28. And yeah, you can read about those. It's not verse 1 to 15, it's verse 11 to 15. And it's just described at the head of the month, but it was about consecrating the month. So month after month. The end there in verse 15. No, verse 14, it says towards the end there, this is for each month throughout the months of the year, that they would consecrate the month and dedicate and set it apart through sacrifices. The second thing that, and these sacrifices would be eaten, so this adds to the festival nature, all right? The second thing is that it's marked with sacrifices of festivity. So this wasn't just because on Yom Kippur there were sacrifices made, but that's more solemn, and you wouldn't even be eating. So that's more about atonement. But these sacrifices were definitely connected to mirth and happiness. And we get that from the other mention of Rosh Chodesh, Numbers chapter 10, where the description is there of verse 10 speaks about the days of your gladness in your appointed feast, and at the Rosh Chodesh. So this was definitely connected to the days of your gladness. Sound these trumpets, and there was these trumpet blasts, particularly at times of gladness that's being mentioned there. And so we have this understanding of mirth, of joy, of gladness. Another scripture we'll get to next also emphasizes that from the book of Hosea. Let's see it. Yeah, so in Hosea chapter 2, verse 11. But despite the mirth here, what I want to focus on with now is that it was also a time where it was not just for the royal family and just for government officials, which we might think of when we're reading about all this calendar stuff. On the calendar level, there was royal decisions needing to be made to dictate for the nation. But it was a time where actually the nation itself would kind of knock off, like we think of it the weekend, we knock off. There was kind of like a month end, the happiness of the new moon, the month, this Rosh Chodesh, and how it would pan out. In Hosea chapter 2, verse 11, he says, I will cause all her mirth, her happiness, her joy, that's kind of mirth to cease. Her feast days, that's Chagim, so it's pointing to Chagim is definitely mirth days, feast days, feasting and enjoyment and simcha. And then right after that, it's also mentioning her new moon days, definitely connected with feasting and festivity. And then it goes to the kind of lesser ones, or certainly not in terms of festivity and eating and drinking, but also time of mirth, of happiness, but of the Sabbath and other appointed times. But here we get this idea of mirth to cease, and so that's there. But what's also important is this is coming from the northern kingdom of Israel, who weren't going to Jerusalem. This was not in a kingly judicial setting. This would have been what they did. At month end, they would knock off. End of day 29, they would go off. They would be looking for the sun, and it would seem as though day 30 and day 1 was Rosh Chodesh, and they could, they would slaughter, they would slaughter the bull and the lamb and whatever, and enjoy that time. So this wasn't just for the royal family, but it was a nationwide thing. Another place pointing to the nationwide thing was how how David managed to get out of being at that Chodesh festival with Saul, King Saul, is that his description in 1 Samuel chapter 28, the lie that Jonathan gave, is that he said, David earnestly asked permission of me to go to Bethlehem, and he said, please let me go, for our family has a sacrifice in the city, and my brother has commanded me to be there. And now if I found favor in your sight, please let me go my way. So it was a key time. It was an obvious time that in the cities that they would make sacrifices at these times, and they would slaughter the bull, and there would be this for the broader nation as well, and on that level. What also seems interesting from Scripture, and this is a really important part, is that it seems like all people were welcome to attend. But like Sabbath, where Sabbath is not like it's not a commercial box office production, okay, where you pay tickets at the door. It needed to be a service so that whether you're rich or poor, that all have access to the set apart time with God. Same thing with the Rosh Chodesh, that it seems as though really this festive time when these sacrifices were made, whether you were the least or the greatest, they all had a right to be there at the festivities. And there was almost a culture, it would seem, of a kind of family level, a clan level, and being mindful of it's a day where, some of those people who you may look over, they come, they're going to be here, and you would check up on them. Let's say you were wealthy and what have you. You would check up on them, make sure they're doing well, and a little bit of tending to their affairs, and making sure that they at least have a great meal. We see this idea of accessibility, of all being welcome, within 2 Kings chapter 4 verse 23, and this is a really interesting description. It's so insightful. Well, it helps us get a little bit of a picture. Is the description here with Elijah in his day, 2 Kings 4:23, where the husband says to a lady who's going to Elijah, he said, why are you going to him today? It is neither the Chodesh, okay, it is not the head of the month, nor the Sabbath. Okay, and so this is quite interesting, because we just see this even with the holy man, like, what makes you think you're going to get through to him now? But there was obviously a sense at Chodesh that you were accessible, and people could interact with you, and you didn't have a form of officials who were not a part of the common people, as it were. This comes through some other scriptures as well. Particularly, it seems to be Sabbath and Chodesh, and the month, the head of the month. So in Ezekiel 46, there's the description here. Yeah, anyway, you can read that passage. It talks about this, the future prince is coming back to Israel, and it says, on the Sabbath day, the temple will be opened up, as well as on the Chodesh. During the day, it's going to be opened up, and then in the evening, they'll shut the doors. And the people will worship with the prince. There's this, and the doors will be open, and there's this again, this idea of worship and accessibility, and together they will be able to, and it's interesting because it's talking about specifically on the Sabbath and the Chodesh. And this might also be why the rebuke of Amos, which I know for many is for me, I've been staring at this for a while, but I think we may have a bit of understanding of what it's speaking of here. In Amos chapter 8, from verse 4 to 6, we read this strange statement in here where people are saying, when will the new moon be passed that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath that we may trade wheat? And I think it's not so much that the new moon was a Sabbath, but it was kind of like a Sabbath, especially for those in authority, because they needed to officiate this feast and be just mindful of people, but they had to also attend to the needs of the poor. They needed to actually spend time with the poor. And that's why it actually brings out this issue of the poor, where the reason for selling grain, it's not because they're desiring to sell the grain, not because they're so sick and tired of this is a Sabbath. That's not the reason. What's scary is that it goes in verse 6 where it says, sell the grain that we may buy the poor for silver, and the needy for a pair of sandals. Verse 4 also speaks about this, that the complaint here is that they weren't using the Chodesh to lift up the poor. In fact, the description is there that they were allowing the poor to fail. They were not trying to establish those in need and to try and make sure they could be planted and established within their people. So that's quite interesting. We get this idea of, it's not just access, but also this kind of communal spirit of it was important that the poor be there and that they had access to you. And maybe there were a few complaints of this and that, and you had to attend to certain needs and be mindful of certain things. But they had shifted to where all they could think of on Chodesh was, I can't wait when the season of festival is over, that I can then go by and then I can enslave these people, which they should actually be raising up and not letting them fail in the land. That description there. Another place that I've had to rethink maybe a little bit of my interpretation is Isaiah 66, and so it is from verse 23. It speaks about the new heavens and the new earth, and it speaks about that people will come from Chodesh, from one Chodesh to another, and from one Sabbath to another. And usually I've been interpreting this as, they're going to go from month to month and from week to week. It seems, in the light of this accessibility thing, and also like familiarity breeds contempt, and there's this nice balance that you need. Well, no, there's this accessibility. They will come from Chodesh to Chodesh because the gates are open over this time. Sabbath as well. There's a level of accessibility there as well. And so often we'll see new moon and Sabbath paired together, and it seems to be from this description. And I also love that after that, it says, all flesh shall come to worship before me. I think that again is pointing to a bit of a mystery here about accessibility. And we know that in terms of our King, that he loved the least of society. All right. Then what we also see, in the scriptures is a description of it. It was a period. Chodesh seems to be a period where sacrifices were called the days of sacrifice, okay, or the sacrifice of the days. And it's in plurality. And that I find really interesting. Now, sadly, the translators have gone on a way of always saying it by year or year by year. But the Hebrew is Zebach ha-Yamim. Yamim is days. I mean, so many other times it's translated as days. And then suddenly when it's connected to the sacrifices and the temple and new moons, it suddenly becomes translated as year by year. And it really shouldn't be. Zebach ha-Yamim. And this also is an interesting description. We get this first in 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 7. That's the description that David said to Jonathan, you tell Saul that I am with my family to make sacrifices of the days. And so there's a plurality in that. And I think if we understood that Rosh Chodesh had to do with Old Moon Day and New Moon Day, that this is at the front of the month, it begins to make a lot of sense. We also see the use with the story of little Samuel and the description of his dad. And again, it's used there where it says that his dad would make Zebach ha-Yamim. And this is translated again a few times as year by year. He would make these sacrifices year by year. No, he would come. If you think about Samuel and his mother, and Ramah was only 14 miles. Okay, that's a lot to us, but I mean, David said, let me just run over to Bethlehem. But they would do these journeys, especially. This was a chance of accessibility to see her son, that they would go up for these vows, the vows of the days, and do these offerings there, and there was accessibility. And so we see that, no, it was most probably month by month. Samuel's mum would come, and she had a little coat that she would give him, and while she was there for the days of sacrifice, he'd wear the coat, and then she would take it home, and maybe an adjustment here, an adjustment there, and whatever, and bring it. And that was the kind of special time that she could spend with him. I assure you, with any mother being 14 miles away from their only child and having accessibility, this was the description here. Really, we should understand in a new moon context. And then we can also, you can look in Leviticus chapter 7. It talks about that there was offerings, there was different peace offerings that they would eat of, and these were done at the temple. People could go there monthly, they could eat, they could make a peace offering, and it speaks about Elkanah, who used to do this, and he would often share the bits. And we know he gave Hannah a double portion, and Penina, she would just get a single portion. But we get a sense of how the time worked there. As well as, what's interesting as well is that it seems that they would leave in the morning. And there's this description in 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 19, that they would obviously sleep over these periods, which is interesting because it's meaning about they got up early to give worship and then they would leave. So they would sleep over, have a feast, they would eat through the night, and then in the morning these offerings, specifically the Thanksgiving peace offerings, you weren't allowed to eat of them beyond the morning. And anyway, they would rise up, and it was like the season was moving on. And I would imagine that Israelites would have to bear in mind, day 2 is coming up, and there's an expectation of back to work when the head of the month is completed. And so we can see this in different places. The other one is 1 Samuel 20, verse 35. The description is on the third day, from when David says the Chodesh is coming up. So the day after that Chodesh, It seems as though Jonathan was winding down and he's shooting bows, and it's as though the day is winding on. And so we also get this sense about how perhaps the feast would be. But there were certainly altars in the different places. There was definitely not just in Jerusalem. People would knock off. There was a sense of mirth and happiness. People would bring their offerings and partake in them. And there's also this interesting description of the sacrifice of the days over that period. All right, so in terms of the Chodesh Festival, I think we have a bit of an idea of how it may have looked and what happened at the head, at the front of the month. Okay, so I've got here basically to summarize my view on how it would look is that towards the end of day 29, you'd be looking forward to the Chodesh. And that did not predict new moon, but it was when they would begin to start looking for new moon. And so it could go two ways. You would either sight it, and that would make it both day 30 and day 31. And I think they would do offerings and whatever. And if you'd made the journey, and anyway, it might have gone into day 2, but people would have been aware, listen, there's work again. So it might have gone through that night. I'm not sure how necessarily would have worked. But then if it wasn't sighted, people would have actually been quite pleased in a way, because it would have become a double season, 2 days of separate 30 and day 1, and that's how they would have kept it. Again, day 1, I would imagine a lot of people would be thinking, let's get back, with the work again. Other diehards may stay on, and they keep on going through. I don't know exactly how it would have gone, but we're getting a picture for how it may have been kept, and certainly the festival atmosphere of it. Right, let me just read this, and this is just a summary of what I think Rosh Chodesh originally was. Although typically only considered to be concerned with day 1, Rosh Chodesh is seen from ancient historical witnesses, Jewish tradition, and scriptural descriptions as being connected to a feast related to day 30 that can be considered Rosh Chodesh, the head of the month. The sacrifices at the front of the month were called the sacrifice of the days and would explain the extended nature of the new moon sighting season. If kept before Yehovah, those partaking of these sacrifices would need to be clean, and the judicious decisions surrounding the month would be made by the executive branch, the king, and the judicial branch, the priestly structure, and the nation's God in front of God. Understanding the complexities of the sighting of the new moon, day 1 would be well connected to day 30 of the previous month. The Chodesh would begin at the start of Old Month Day and would end at the end of New Moon Day, day 1. What does seem apparent is that at the head of the month, people would start looking for the new moon at the start of the 30th day. This was to determine whether the month was a full 30 days or a hollow 30 days. This time would span day 30 and go through another day 1 in a full month, or only day 30/1 in a hollow month. The minor holiday would end a little like the Western weekend, where day 2 of the month would have an influence on when people would start leaving the fest. So that's my kind of assessment of it, and I think there's some new ideas that may have come through, and maybe to get a fuller idea of maybe what happened during that season, and to maybe think about some of these concepts. It's amazing what has been preserved through the astronomical diaries, and how we can understand how the ancients would think of the 30-day month and what they were doing. We've got these descriptions of what they did. In terms of some criticisms, the first one I put here is, people may say, but Rosh Chodesh speaks of, Yom Teruah the Day of Trumpet speaks of Chodesh offerings, therefore it must be on day one. Well, as said, anything on day one, by virtue of, if you believe in the lunar cycle, it's going to be bound up in day 30. And so yes, it shouldn't surprise us that Yom Teruah, there'd be a description of doing the Chodesh offerings with Yom Teruah, but that wouldn't limit it to day one. This would just be a natural expectation of anything on day one, that it would be connected with Rosh Chodesh, the head of the month, and the exact same things described that we've been going through. The second criticism may come is that the day of the Chodesh of Ezekiel 46, that it speaks of it in a singular, well, day can have a broader understanding, like the day of the Lord. It's not necessarily like a 24-hour period. There's different ways in which Yom can be understood. However, I think in the case of Ezekiel 46, it is that it's actually talking about the daylight hours of the Chodesh season, or the Chodesh period. That at the beginning of the day, that's when they would open up the gates that are described there, and then it says, and they would shut them in the evening. So the day, it's in that literal like of daylight, day and night, speaking in that sense, not in terms of a calendar day. So I think, I think that might be the explanation of it. I'm not too sure. I'll be honest. But needless to say, even if you believed that the day of the Chodesh is day one, again, how could you open it up during the day? Not on day 30, because testimony may come that it will be on that time. So we have to think these things through a bit and the practical implication. Another one is that there's no scriptural description of day 30. Well, that's not quite true. I mean, we can see there's references in Noah of counting from, I think it was the 16th of the fifth month of the first month through to the 16th of the sixth month, and that was described as 150 days. That months, you could generally speak of months as 30-day periods. That seems to come through the scriptures. We see it with Ezekiel and his 390-day act of lying on his side for the house of Israel, and then that's essentially 13 months. And the ancients would have had a way of they could speak very colloquially of a month has 30 days, and they were happy with this, and they understood that yes, technically we might have a hollow month where 30 is counted with day one, but we can see this in the scriptures. The other place where we see it is with the 3.5 years, or the 42 months in the book of Revelation. Also comes from Daniel. The 3.5 months is described as 1,260 days, and Daniel speaks about, well done if you can get to the 1,290th day, and other descriptions like that. It really seems to be in a kind of monthly description, and as a generalization as 30 days. Another complaint or criticism may be that the first, doesn't this get away from the idea of the first day of the month? Well, this is an interesting thing, and this is what piqued my interest a little bit, is to look at the use of our terminology. We'll often just say that this is the first, the first day of the week, the second day of the week, the third day of the week, and we're not using it like there's first place, second place, and third place. And that's understood as ordinal numbering. Okay, that there's an order to this. We can use it in a cardinal way, as it's just numbers. All right. Well, the Hebrew literally does this. Okay, and so like let's say in the weekly cycle, We see from the creation description of the week that what we would say the first day, it's not called the first day, it's called day one. It's called Yom Echad, not Yom Rishon. Rishon would be, see, it's got the root of Rosh, head. It's, you know, the Rishon day is like the first day, the foremost, it has elevation. But we know with the creation week that day one doesn't have any elevation in the typical cycle as we understand. Yeah, perhaps on the day of the first fruits, we see a form of elevation, but generally speaking, day one is just, it's day one. It's not the first day, as Hebrews would kind of elevate it. And we see them do this, for instance, in the 2 weeks of holiday that we have of um, of uh, of unleavened bread and Sukkot. Those day ones, we know they are elevated. There's a Shabbaton and a Holy Convocation, and those are called Yom Rishon. Those every time. It's never Yom Echad. It's not day one. It's the first day. So it's given that emphasis. And so we see that. And so some would say, well, if it's Rosh Chodesh, I mean, it should be the Rosh Rishon. It should be day, you know, the first day. Well, I think we could expect that if day one and only day one was the head day, we would expect on a monthly description that it was the head, that it's the first day. And yet, if you go through all the passages of how the numbering on the monthly system goes, it's the same as the week. It's similar to the week in that it is every time. It's not the first day, it's not Yom Rishon. It is always Yom Echad. It is day one. It's used only in a cardinal numbering way, and that's quite interesting because it might point to, you know, what was ahead was not as simple as you could just say, oh, day one is the head of the month. Well, then we could expect it to be called Yom Rishon. And it's not that simple. As we see, it would appear from the testimony, day 30 was also very much involved. And so, yeah, I think even though first does have this idea of Rosh, just understand on a monthly setting, it's not used, that isn't the description. Even though English translations will talk about the first day, underlying Hebrew is saying Yom Echad, every time. All right. And what else could be a criticism? Some might say that this is predicting new moon. No, it is not. Definitely, you can predict day 30, but you can never predict new moon. In fact, as I was describing, you'd have Yom Teruah. You have no idea when. Even if you have beautiful skies and you don't see it, you never know. Someone else may see it, and even we saw these places where even there's more ambiguity because the king could also, depending on the site of the next night, was it 2 lots of cloud cover? How high was it? There was even other areas as well where you just have no idea of in terms of new moon. In terms of the time of feasting, yes, that would be a consequence. When you get to day 30, that's when the new moon fest, let's say the head of the month fest, would begin. And so no, there's no predictor of new moon. There is predicting of when to begin feasting and looking for the new moon. Another criticism might be that day 30 sighting complicates things. I don't see how that could be a thing. Like, for now, people like the idea of we get told this is the day when there's, you're given just this day of the month. Go look on this one. It's the next viable sighting day. And and no one's talking about day 30, and this is complicating things. Well, think about ancient cultures. This is one of the things that pushed me in this direction to relook at Rosh Chodesh. Is in ancient cultures they did not have websites that would say, on this night we have 0.5% illumination on the moon, therefore there's no point really looking. Or on this night we have 1.5, we'll definitely see it on this night. There wasn't that kind of uh, awareness. Perhaps, yes, at Saul's Chodesh, I think there would have been astronomers, and I think the priests would have been very involved with certain calculations and stuff. But the average person, this was not the case. And so I think it actually works in a very agrarian, a very basic understanding that people would have understood. The month is 30 days. When we get to day 30, we're going to see, is it a full month, or is it a hollow month? Is it completed? Is it rejected? And just beginning of day 30, you go out and you have a look. So I don't think it complicates things at all. And then some might also say that this causes division. I certainly don't want that to be the case at all. I'm just pointing out that there seems to be, this day 30 does seem to be really tied to day 1 when you really think about it, and the description of other witnesses. And actually, I'm actually excited because it kind of lends the idea to, especially over Yom Teruah, you can actually enjoy 2 days. There's an extra, it's kind of an extra, because of the uncertainty of it, you get to keep things for an expanded period, and that's quite exciting as well. And there'll be an important lesson to learn in that as well, and being uncertain and not sure, and not knowing what the decision may be. There'll be good lessons to learn from this, and so I think there are a lot of positives that can come from this. But the one thing is that certainly, I think till now we've been very focused on the sighting of the moon sliver and those kind of things, and we definitely have, I think, a lot of witness for that's how it was done in the ancient world. However, I think not enough has been thought about how they would regulate it within a hollow month and a full month idea. This idea that we do see of they would look on one night and on another night and make a call. So this is really interesting, and so I encourage people out there to just meditate on these things, and hopefully we can grow in us understanding the times of Chodesh, the times of new moon, what would happen at the head of the month, and so that we could consecrate. We could consecrate seasons like we have our weekly convocations, that it establishes an idea of the weekly cycle. And same with the month, that we can give thanks for our months and be mindful of the months, and be aware of giving thanks, and how they would have done that in the ancient world. May it all just reflect him at the end of the day. And so I hope my discussion of this will just give an added sense of what was the Chodesh Festival. Now, I need to say this here. We don't see that it is for the average Israelite. We certainly do not see you shall have a holy convocation, or set apart gathering on at the Chodesh. It just seems as though it was done as a festive period. We don't see much more than that. But we do get these themes coming through of important ones, at least in ancient world, of accessibility, of not being too aloof, and being able to connect with the least. And that these are important things to be aware of in a culture and as a nation that stands before God, and to represent Him well to the nations around us. And anyway, so a lot of these thoughts, I hope will be a blessing to you, and ultimately will give glory to the God of Israel. Thank you. Shalom.